Attention! Prepare for a deep dive into one of Baltimore's most macabre and disturbing cases. Before you begin, I ask that you write in the comments below where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. We also ask that you subscribe by clicking the subscribe button to help us produce more documented accounts like this one every day. During the harsh winter of 1948, an officially unregistered church began operating in the cellars of an old meat processing warehouse in the industrial area of Locust Point, Baltimore. The building, constructed in 1912, had remained partially abandoned after the Great Depression, with only the ground floor being used for storing boxes and broken machinery. What drew the attention of local authorities was not the existence of the congregation itself. Small religious groups constantly arose in the post-war turmoil, but the sudden disappearance of Margaret Holloway, a 47-year-old widow who had lost her husband and 2 children during the conflict in Europe. When police finally entered the location, 6 weeks after the first missing person report, they did not find Margaret, but instead 17 rolls of 16mm film, meticulously labeled with names and dates, all stored in a refrigerated room that once served as a cold chamber for meat. Reverend Samuel Porter, a 62-year-old thin man with deeply sunken eyes and prematurely white hair, showed no resistance during the initial questioning, simply stating, "No one has disappeared. They are preserved forever in our archives. Every breath, every blink, every movement, all 17, that is what our mission is about. Filming the moment the soul leaves the body and recording where it goes. The case of the filmmakers from beyond, as it was dubbed by the Baltimore Sun in a small note published on page 23 of the February 18, 1948 edition, quickly vanished from local newspapers. The official story, confirmed by the Baltimore Police Department in a brief statement, was that Margaret Holloway had been found in Washington, District of Columbia, apparently suffering from temporary amnesia induced by prolonged grief. As for Reverend Porter and his small congregation, authorities declared that it was merely an eccentric group practicing harmless, albeit disturbing, rituals with no evidence of crime. The films, according to the report, contained only static images of lit candles and moments of prayer. The case was officially closed on March 12, 1948. But what the official records failed to mention, and what remained hidden for decades, was the disappearance of 16 other individuals within an 80-kilometer radius of Baltimore during the 14 months prior to the church's discovery. 16 people, 17 rolls of film, and a secret that would take almost 20 years to begin emerging from the shadows. The Locust Point neighborhood, where the warehouse was located, was known for its community of dock workers and immigrants, mainly Poles and Irish who had found employment in the docks and factories of the region. The post-war economy had brought relative prosperity, but also a sense of displacement and uncertainty for many returning from the conflict or who had lost loved ones. Mrs. Edith Krawczyk, owner of a small grocery store 2 blocks from the warehouse, reported years later that she noticed a strange movement of people on Sunday nights, especially during the colder months. They always walked alone, never in groups, always with downcast eyes as if they were ashamed, and they always carried something small in their hands, a photograph perhaps, or a folded letter, something personal, something that meant something to them. According to the few parish records recovered decades later, the Church of Eternal Revelation, as the group led by Porter called itself, had begun as a small Bible study circle in 1946, initially meeting in the living room of the residence of Howard and Meredith Dalton, a middle-aged couple who had lost their only son Nathan during the Normandy landing. Howard, an unemployed chemical engineer who had briefly worked for Eastman Kodak during the 1930s, possessed advanced knowledge of photography and film development, a skill that would prove central to the group's later activities. as revealed by a former neighbor of the Daltons in an interview granted to the Baltimore Evening Sun in 1965. The meetings began to attract other grieving families, mainly those who had lost young people in the war. What began as sessions of comfort and prayer soon evolved into something more structured. When Samuel Porter, a former military chaplain who had briefly served in the Pacific, assumed leadership of the group. The winter of 1947 to 1948 was particularly severe in Baltimore. Consecutive snowstorms kept much of the city paralyzed for weeks, which may explain why Margaret Holloway's disappearance took so long to be noticed. Living alone after the loss of her family, Margaret rarely received visitors, with the exception of her niece, Catherine Holloway, a 23-year-old nursing student who visited her on Sundays. It was Catherine who reported the disappearance to the police on January 4, 1948, after 3 weeks without contact with her aunt. In her testimony, preserved in the Baltimore Police Department archives, Catherine mentioned that Margaret had talked about a church that could show people what happened after death, but did not attach much importance to it, assuming it was common religious metaphor. Margaret Holloway's house on Light Avenue, number 417, remained intact when the police first inspected it on January 6th. There were no signs of struggle or forced entry. The bed was made. A copy of the Baltimore Sun from December 16, 1947, was folded on the kitchen table. A half-finished cup of tea with a thin layer of mold on the surface suggested the house had been abandoned in haste. On the bedside table next to the bed, investigators found a framed photograph of a young man in military uniform, David Holloway, her youngest son, killed in Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. And inside Margaret's Bible, a small handwritten pamphlet that read only, "Death is not the end. Separation is temporary. Come see for yourself. Sundays, 8 p.m. Fulton Building, rear entrance, Locust Point." Early investigations into Reverend Samuel Porter revealed little beyond a man with an apparently ordinary past. Military records indicated that he had served as an auxiliary chaplain in the Pacific Theater for only 4 months in 1944, before being discharged for unspecified medical issues. Before the war, he had worked as a religious studies teacher at a small Presbyterian college in Delaware, a position he left in 1941. There were no records of criminal behavior, nor any indication that he had formal theological training, beyond a bachelor's degree in religious studies. What intrigued investigators, however, was the complete absence of records between his military discharge in September 1944 and his reappearance in Baltimore in late 1946. 2 full years seemed to have been erased from his life. Howard Dalton, the engineer who helped found the church, kept a meticulously organized notebook with technical notes on photographic equipment and chemical formulas for film development. This notebook, seized during the initial investigation, but later returned to the Daltons when the case was closed, contained torn-out pages corresponding to the months of November and December 1947, exactly the period when Margaret Holloway was thought to have disappeared. Meredith Dalton, in her brief testimony recorded on February 8, 1948, stated that her husband was just trying to capture the invisible, what we all want to see, what happens when we close our eyes for the last time. When asked specifically about Margaret, Meredith only replied she wanted to see David again so much. Any mother would understand. What truly drew the authorities' attention to the case was not the disappearance itself, but an anonymous phone call received by the Baltimore Police Department on January 29, 1948. The call record, preserved in the archives and later recovered by journalist Robert Lancaster in 1962, contained the transcript of the brief dialogue, "They are filming people when they die. In the old slaughterhouse, 17 so far. They truly believe they are capturing the soul leaving the body. The Reverend told them the camera can see what the eyes cannot. And they believe it." My God, they truly believe it. The informant hung up before any questions could be asked. The first entry into the warehouse occurred on February 2nd, 1948, with a small team of 3 police officers led by Sergeant William Harrington. According to his report, they found the basement organized as a small makeshift chapel with rustic wooden benches arranged in rows before a simple altar. On the walls, enlarged black and white photographs showed what appeared to be military funerals. A 16mm projector was positioned in the center of the space. The environment smelled of mold, incense, and something Harrington described as photography chemicals. In the report, Harrington mentioned that the location appeared to have been recently tidied up, as if they were expecting visitors. No one was present during this first inspection. It was only on the second entry, 5 days later, that authorities found Samuel Porter and 4 other members of the congregation, including Howard and Meredith Dalton. The other 2 present were identified as Robert Thompson, a 56-year-old glassmaker who had lost his wife to tuberculosis in 1945, and Alice Gaines, a 64-year-old retired nurse. All were seated in a circle around a table where what appeared to be basic medical equipment rested: a stethoscope, syringes, medicine vials, and a small tank that investigators initially presumed to be oxygen. It was during this inspection that the 17 rolls of film were discovered in the old cold chamber, each carefully labeled with a name and a date. One of the rolls bore the name Margaret Holloway and the date December 16, 1947, exactly the day the newspaper found in her kitchen had been published. The 5 church members were taken for interrogation, but remained notably consistent in their testimonies. All vehemently denied any involvement in criminal activities. According to them, the Church of Eternal Revelation offered comfort to grieving people, using spiritual photography techniques to capture manifestations from the beyond that supposedly occurred during intense moments of prayer and meditation. Reverend Porter, in particular, maintained an unsettling calm throughout the interrogation, repeating that no one was harmed. "We merely recorded what was always there, invisible to ordinary eyes." When questioned specifically about Margaret, Porter replied, "She came of her own free will. She left of her own free will. Ask her when you find her." And in fact, Margaret Holloway was found 3 days later, on February 11th, in a low-cost hotel in Washington, District of Columbia, seemingly confused but physically unharmed. Her official testimony, recorded on February 12th, contains notable inconsistencies and moments of apparent confusion. She claimed to have decided to take a spontaneous vacation after the end-of-year holidays, but could not explain why she had not taken any luggage or notified her niece. When questioned about the Church of Eternal Revelation, Margaret initially denied knowledge, but when shown the pamphlet found in her Bible, she changed her story, vaguely stating that she had visited once or twice, but didn't think it was important. The most disturbing part, however, was her response when asked about the film with her name. "Some things are better left in the dark. There are things we shouldn't see, things that, once seen, cannot be unseen. I want to go home now. Please let me go home." Margaret Holloway returned to her home on Light Avenue the next day. Her niece, Catherine, later reported that her aunt seemed changed in some way, quieter, distant, as if she were only partially present. Margaret never mentioned the church or Reverend Porter again. Approximately 3 weeks after her return, she sold her house and moved to Florida, where she lived in relative isolation until her death in 1959. The official cause of death was recorded as multiple organ failure, despite Margaret being only 58 years old at the time. The case of the filmmakers from beyond was officially closed, but important questions remained unanswered. The 17 rolls of film, listed as evidence in the initial report, were curiously omitted from the final inventory when the case was filed. When Sergeant William Harrington was questioned about this discrepancy years later, in 1967, He simply stated that some items were returned to their rightful owners. No copy or transcription of the film's content was preserved in the official records. The Church of Eternal Revelation apparently dissolved after the investigation, with the warehouse being sold in March 1948 to a chemical company that used the space for storage until 1964. In the years that followed the incident, both Howard and Meredith Dalton kept out of the spotlight. Howard found employment as a photographic lab technician at a commercial studio in Baltimore, while Meredith worked as a receptionist in a medical office. The couple rarely socialized with neighbors or co-workers. In a rare interview granted to a local newspaper in 1952, Howard was briefly questioned about his involvement with the Church of Eternal Revelation, to which he merely replied, "We were looking for answers to impossible questions. Sometimes it's better not to find them." The interview, originally about photographic techniques, did not delve deeper into the subject. Robert Thompson, one of the members found in the warehouse during the second police inspection, moved to Pittsburgh shortly after the incident, and there are no records of his whereabouts after 1950. Alice Gaines remained in Baltimore, living an apparently ordinary life until her death from natural causes in 1956. As for Reverend Samuel Porter, he disappeared completely from the public record after the case was closed. There are no records of employment, residence, or even death in his name in any American state in the following 2 decades. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. The story might have ended there, buried in the dusty archives of the Baltimore Police Department, were it not for a young film student from Johns Hopkins University named Daniel Hayes. In 1962, while researching for his thesis on the use of documentary footage in the post-war era, Hayes found a brief mention of the Filmmakers from Beyond case in an old edition of the Baltimore Sun. Intrigued, he began to investigate further, initially facing significant resistance from local authorities. It was Hayes who first established the connection between the 17 film rolls found in the warehouse and the 16 unsolved cases of disappearances that occurred in the region during the months prior to the church's discovery. Between April 1946 and December 1947, 16 people had disappeared within an 80-kilometer radius around Baltimore. All cases shared similar characteristics: middle-aged or elderly individuals living alone or with limited family contact, all with a recent history of significant loss. In most cases, the investigations were superficial and quickly filed, attributed to voluntary departure or undocumented moves. What Hayes discovered, however, was that none of these people ever reappeared. None, except Margaret Holloway. The first of these disappearances was that of George Whitman, a 61-year-old widowed accountant who had lost his son in the Battle of Iwo Jima. Whitman disappeared on April 22, 1946, leaving behind an organized apartment and no sign of disturbance. The last record of his whereabouts was a purchase receipt from a convenience store 3 blocks from the location where, months later, the Church of Eternal Revelation would be established. Among the 17 rolls of film discovered in the warehouse, one was labeled George Whitman, May 7, 1946, exactly 2 weeks after his disappearance. Hayes's investigation gained momentum when he managed to locate and interview Catherine Holloway, Margaret's niece, who now worked as a head nurse at a Baltimore hospital. Catherine, initially reluctant, finally revealed unsettling details about her aunt's behavior after her return from Washington. "She didn't sleep anymore," Catherine reported. "At least not with the lights off. I found her several times sitting in the living room in the middle of the night, staring fixedly at the empty wall as if watching something projected there. When I asked what she was seeing, Aunt Margaret just smiled and said, 'The continuation. What comes next? What has always been there, waiting for all of us.'" Catherine also revealed that in the weeks before her move to Florida, Margaret had become obsessive with family photographs, particularly those showing her son David. She spent hours studying every detail, every expression. Once I found her tracing the outline of his face with a pencil, as if trying to memorize every line. But the most disturbing thing, according to Catherine, was the notebook Margaret kept hidden between the mattress and the bed, a diary Catherine only discovered after her aunt's departure. The pages were filled with meticulous drawings of what appeared to be film frames, each captioned with cryptic observations: first movement, left hand, fingers; second movement, right eyelid; third movement, lower lip. The sequence matters. The sequence is the key. In search of more information, Hayes managed to track down Meredith Dalton, now a widow after Howard's death in a car accident in 1959. Initially resistant, Meredith finally agreed to a single interview in her small house in the Baltimore suburbs in September 1962. The recording of this conversation, preserved in the Johns Hopkins University archives, reveals a woman still deeply traumatized, alternating between moments of frightening clarity and almost incoherent rambling. Howard knew how to make the chemistry work, Meredith explained. It wasn't just ordinary photography, it was something more, something he had developed during his time at Kodak, but never shared with anyone there, a special emulsion that could capture more. Light that the eyes don't see, movements that happen too fast to be noticed. When questioned about the films found in the warehouse, Meredith became visibly agitated. You don't understand. They weren't films of the people. They were films of the after, of what happens when we cross over, the first few seconds, minutes, hours, depending on how long we could maintain the exposure. Pressed on exactly how these films were produced, Meredith suddenly refused to continue the interview, repeatedly muttering, "No one suffered. They all consented. They all wanted to see their loved ones again." Another significant breakthrough in Hayes's investigation occurred when he managed to locate a former lab assistant who had briefly worked for Howard Dalton in 1947. The man, who requested anonymity, described unusual chemical preparations that Dalton frequently produced after hours. "It wasn't just standard film developer," he explained. "It had compounds I had never seen used in photography. Some of the substances came in unlabeled vials, and he always handled them with extreme care, wearing thick gloves and a mask. Once I asked what it was for, and he said something strange. He said, 'To reveal what is hidden between the frames. The intermediate moments the camera captures, but are normally washed out during development.'" In October 1962, after months of insistence, Hayes finally managed to get permission to examine the original case files. It was then that he discovered the most disturbing discrepancy. According to the preliminary medical report, never officially included in the process, the tank found along with the medical equipment on the table in the warehouse did not contain oxygen, as initially presumed, but carbon monoxide. The syringes, analyzed in the lab, contained morphine residues in doses far above the therapeutically recommended. The report, signed by Dr. James Livingston, pathologist for the Baltimore Police Department, concluded with a handwritten observation. "The instruments suggest a method of controlled euthanasia. I recommend further investigation." This report was apparently filed separately from the main case and never mentioned in the official conclusions. Armed with this new evidence, Hayes sought out Sergeant William Harrington, now retired and living in a small house in Annapolis. After initial reluctance, Harrington finally agreed to speak on the condition of not being recorded. According to Hayes's written account, the former police officer still seemed profoundly disturbed by the case, even after 15 years. "Those films," Harrington said, "I've never seen anything like it. Technically, they didn't show anything illegal. Just faces. Faces in extreme close-up, filmed in slow motion. Eyes, mouths, expressions subtly changing. There was no context, no clear indication of what was happening. But there was something deeply wrong with those images. something you felt in your gut. Harrington then revealed the reason why the case was closed so abruptly and why the films were not preserved as evidence. Orders from above, he explained, very high up the chain of command. Someone with influence didn't want this case in the newspapers. A scandal involving a church filming, well, whatever they were filming, wouldn't be good for Baltimore's image. So the case was buried. The films were confiscated, not by the department, but by federal agents. I never knew where they were taken. Intrigued by the mention of federal involvement, Hayes expanded his investigation to include Federal Bureau of Investigation records. Through the Freedom of Information Act, he managed to obtain partially censored documents indicating that the case had been briefly monitored by the FBI under the classification Unauthorized Experiments, Possible National Security Interest. The documents reference something called Persistent Vision Project, apparently a secret government initiative from the early 1940s that investigated unconventional methods of interrogation and intelligence using advanced photographic techniques. Samuel Porter's name appeared in several of these documents, although the specific context was completely censored. In April 1963, Hayes's investigation suffered a significant setback when his apartment was broken into and all his notes and materials related to the case were stolen. Local police treated the incident as a common robbery, despite valuable items like his television and camera being left behind. 2 weeks later, Hayes was approached by an unidentified man while walking on the university campus. The man, described by Hayes as ordinary-looking, wearing a nondescript grey suit, did not identify himself but advised Hayes to seek other topics for your thesis. Some files remain closed for good reasons. Shaken but not deterred, Hayes redirected his approach. Instead of focusing on the potentially criminal or governmental aspects of the case, he began investigating the technical aspect of the alleged photographs from beyond that the Church of Eternal Revelation claimed to produce. Consulting photography and chemistry experts, Hayes gradually pieced together a theory about what Howard Dalton and Reverend Porter might be trying to do. According to Professor Alan Richardson, a specialist in the history of photography at Columbia University, consulted by Hayes, there was a long tradition of attempts to capture images of the spiritual world using photographic techniques. Since the 19th century, spiritual photography has been a persistent thread, usually associated with fraud, but occasionally pursued with genuine scientific conviction, Richardson explained. What makes the Baltimore case unique is the apparent technical sophistication involved. If this Dalton really was a Kodak-trained chemist, he could theoretically have developed photographic emulsions with unusual spectral sensitivity, potentially capable of recording wavelengths outside the normal visible spectrum. More unsettling, however, was the theory proposed by Dr. Malcolm Werner, a neurologist Hayes consulted regarding the effects of high doses of morphine combined with carbon monoxide exposure. This is a method that would induce a specific state of slow death, where consciousness would gradually diminish while the body still maintained minimal functions, Werner explained. Theoretically, if someone were filming an individual during this process, they could capture tiny facial changes, micro-movements of muscles, pupillary dilations, changes in skin color that occur during the final stages of consciousness. In essence, filming the last moments of conscious brain activity. This hypothesis gained credibility when Hayes managed to interview a former congregation member who had attended the initial services of the Church of Eternal Revelation, but withdrew before the more extreme activities began. The man, identified only as Thomas in Hayes's records, described how the services always culminated with the screening of films that Reverend Porter called revelations. In the beginning, they were just ordinary images, Thomas reported. Black and white photographs of people who had recently died, usually family members of the congregation. Porter talked about how these images contained traces of the soul, that could be amplified through collective prayer and intense concentration. He made us look at these images for long periods, sometimes for an hour or more, while he narrated what we were supposedly seeing: small movements, changing expressions, signs that the person's essence was still present. Thomas continued, "Over time, the films became different. Porter started using the 16mm projector, showing what he called transitions, extremely slow-motion films of faces in close-up, so close it was often difficult to recognize they were human faces, just an eye, a mouth, part of a forehead. Movements so subtle you weren't sure if you were actually seeing something change or if it was just your mind searching for patterns. Porter said we were witnessing the exact moment the soul left the body and what came next." According to Thomas, the atmosphere in the congregation became increasingly intense and isolated from the outside world. Porter started talking about going beyond passive observation. He said we had been chosen for a greater purpose, not just to witness the transition, but to actively document it, to record what no one else could see for the benefit of humanity. That's when Thomas decided to leave. Something about the way he talked about active documentation made me deeply uncomfortable, and the way the other members looked at him, as if they were hypnotized, willing to do anything he asked. In November 1963, after more than a year of investigation, Hayes prepared to present his findings as part of his doctoral thesis. 3 days before the scheduled defense date, however, he was found dead in his apartment, apparently a victim of carbon monoxide poisoning due to a faulty heater. The local police quickly classified the death as accidental, despite the fact that Hayes's apartment had central heating and the small heater that supposedly caused his death had never been seen by any of his friends or colleagues before. All materials related to his investigation into the Church of Eternal Revelation disappeared from his apartment and his university office. His incomplete thesis, filed in the Johns Hopkins Film Department, had the original title, "Images from the Beyond, the Church of Eternal Revelation and the Documentation of Death in Baltimore, 1948. But the content had been replaced by a conventional study on post-war documentary filmmaking techniques. The only evidence that Hayes had actually investigated the Filmmakers from Beyond case were some marginal notes in his personal notebooks, which were returned to his family after his death, and the few recorded interviews he had deposited in a safety deposit box at a local bank, with instructions to be opened only in the event of his death. For almost 2 years, the case remained dormant again, until in January 1965, Robert Lancaster, a journalist for the Baltimore Evening Sun who had briefly known Hayes before his death, decided to resume the investigation. Through the materials preserved in the safety deposit box, Lancaster was able to reconstruct part of Hayes's work and expand the investigation in new directions. One of Lancaster's first significant discoveries was the identification of a pattern in the 17 disappearances, including Margaret Holloway, connected to the Church of Eternal Revelation. All had occurred at regular intervals of exactly 21 days, with only 2 exceptions. This pattern coincided with the new moon phases, a detail that initially seemed insignificant until Lancaster discovered, through interviews with former neighbors of the Daltons, that Howard maintained an obsessive interest in astronomy and frequently discussed the photochemical properties of moonlight. In March 1965, Lancaster achieved something Hayes never could: an interview with one of the people whose name appeared on the film labels found in the warehouse. Eleanor Richards, a 72-year-old woman living in a Virginia nursing home, had been reported missing in June 1947, only to inexplicably reappear 2 months later in Pittsburgh, apparently suffering from severe amnesia. Like Margaret Holloway, she had been one of the few who returned. The interview, conducted at the nursing home where Eleanor had lived since 1958, revealed a woman with severely compromised cognitive abilities, diagnosed with early-onset dementia. During most of the conversation, Eleanor seemed confused and disconnected, answering questions with rambling, disjointed remarks about her late husband and daughter, both killed during a bombing in London where the family was visiting relatives. However, when Lancaster mentioned the name Reverend Porter, Eleanor's reaction was immediate and disturbing. "He showed the way," she said suddenly, her voice clearer than it had been throughout the interview. "He had the right eyes to see, eyes that could see through, cameras in his eyes." Eleanor then began to describe in surprisingly vivid detail an experience she called the process. "First, you drink the special tea, sweet but with a strange taste underneath. Then they take you to the cold room, very cold, to preserve, they say. The lights are so bright you can barely keep your eyes open. The machine makes a noise, click, 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 right next to your face. And then the Reverend says, 'Now you will see your family again. Now you will cross over.'" When Lancaster asked what happened next, Eleanor suddenly became agitated. "You can't go back," she murmured repeatedly. "After you see, you can't come all the way back. Part of you stays there, with them, forever in the films." Intrigued by this mention of the cold room, Lancaster revisited the original warehouse plans, obtained through municipal records. He discovered that the old cold chamber where the films were found had been significantly modified before the arrival of the Church of Eternal Revelation. The walls had been reinforced with additional insulation and a much more powerful industrial refrigeration system than would be needed for normal food storage had been installed. More significantly, a complex ventilation system had been built, with ducts leading from the basement to the building's roof, a detail that did not appear in any of the original police reports. In May 1965, Lancaster managed to locate one of the technicians who had worked on modifying the warehouse's refrigeration system in 1946. The man, Arnold Jeffries, clearly recalled the work due to the unusual specifications. The client wanted a constant temperature of exactly 3 degrees Celsius, no more, no less, with controlled humidity at 30%. That's much more precise than any normal food storage would require. When I asked what it would be used for, he said it was for preserving sensitive photographic materials. I assumed it would be some kind of specialized laboratory. Jeffries also remembered disturbing details about the lighting installed in the room. They wanted a specific configuration of lights, ultraviolet lamps alternating with ordinary white lights, all in a circular arrangement on the ceiling, pointing towards the center of the room. I had never seen anything like it before. And there were cameras. 16mm cameras mounted on fixed tripods, arranged in a circle, all pointing to the same central point, as if they were going to film something important from multiple angles simultaneously. In July 1965, after months of insistence, Lancaster finally gained access to what remained of the warehouse, now partially demolished, to make way for a new industrial development. Accompanied by a newspaper photographer and a structural engineer, he examined what remained of the basement, particularly the area where the old cold chamber had been. The room itself had been completely dismantled, but upon examining the concrete floor, the engineer noticed something strange. A central drain that did not appear on the building's original plans, installed later and connected not to the main sewage system, but to a separate tank that had been buried beneath the floor. With reluctant permission from local authorities, the tank was excavated and opened. Inside, they found approximately 50 liters of a viscous, darkened liquid that, when analyzed by an independent laboratory, turned out to be a complex mixture of photographic chemicals, including silver nitrate in high concentration, various bromides, and several organic substances that analysts could not fully identify. According to the laboratory report, the mixture had strongly photoreactive and potentially toxic properties. More disturbing, however, was what they found at the bottom of the tank. Fragments of what appeared to be partially dissolved 16mm film strips. On the margins of the fragment there were what appeared to be handwritten notes, but the text was too deteriorated to be legible, with the exception of a single number, 17. In September 1965, Lancaster published his first article about the case in the Baltimore Evening Sun, under the title, "The Mystery of the Filmmakers from Beyond, What Really Happened in the Fulton Warehouse." The detailed 3-page report presented many of his investigation's findings, although carefully framed as questions and possibilities, not as direct accusations of criminal activity. Even in the degraded state, one of the lab technicians managed to identify what appeared to be an image, an extreme close-up of what could be a human eye, the pupil dilated to the point where there was almost no visible iris. The public response was surprisingly lukewarm. The story seemed too distant, too obscure to capture the popular imagination. Some readers wrote letters to the editor suggesting that Lancaster was making up a sensational story from an eccentric but harmless cult. The real reaction, however, came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the article's publication, Lancaster received an anonymous letter containing a single yellowed page that seemed to have been torn from a notebook. The page contained a meticulous drawing of a circular arrangement of cameras pointing towards the center of a room, with technical notes on angles and focal distances. In the center of the page, written in faded red ink, were the words, "The secret is in the simultaneity. 17 cameras, 17 angles. 17 moments capturing the same second of transition." Attached to the drawing was a small piece of 16mm film, approximately 3 centimeters long, containing only a few frames. When Lancaster managed to project this fragment, it showed what appeared to be part of a human face in extreme close-up, an eye, part of the nose, a cheek. The image was grainy and partially out of focus, but what was striking was a strange effect in the area around the eye. What appeared to be a kind of distortion or ripple, as if the air were vibrating, creating a pattern of movement that did not seem natural. On the margin of the fragment there was the partially visible name Marga, presumably referring to Margaret Holloway. In the following months, Lancaster continued publishing articles about the case, increasingly focused on the theory that was forming in his mind. The Church of Eternal Revelation was not simply conducting eccentric spiritual sessions or even committing euthanasia on willing members. They were systematically documenting the moment of death of 17 different individuals, using a combination of advanced photographic techniques, chemical knowledge, and a precise understanding of the death process induced by carbon monoxide and morphine. Lancaster's hypothesis was that Reverend Porter and Howard Dalton genuinely believed that, by using the specific arrangement of 17 cameras filming simultaneously, combined with special photographic emulsions sensitive to light spectra normally invisible, they could capture something that escaped normal perception, the exact moment human consciousness was extinguished and what Porter called the transition occurred. In December 1965, Lancaster received another anonymous correspondence, this time containing a page that seemed to have been torn from Howard Dalton's notebook. The page contained complex chemical equations and a diagram labeled "Ideal Configuration for Transition Capture." The diagram showed a circle with 17 equidistant points on the circumference, each marked with a number from 1 to 17. In the center of the circle was a single point labeled S, presumably subject. Lines connected each numbered point to the center, and next to each line was a specific angle noted in degrees. At the bottom of the page, a handwritten note read, "Absolute simultaneity is essential. Even a misalignment of 0.001 seconds between cameras will result in complete loss of the phenomenon. The effect is only visible when all 17 perspectives are captured at the exact same instant." This new evidence led Lancaster to consult Professor Alan Richardson, the specialist in the history of photography, again. After examining the diagram and the notes, Richardson offered an unsettling interpretation. What these men seem to have attempted to do is create a kind of multi-dimensional photography. The theory seems to be that by capturing exactly the same instant from 17 precisely calculated angles, they could somehow record aspects of reality that are not visible from any single perspective. It is an almost mathematical approach to transcending the limitations of human perception. Richardson continued, "Historically, there are precedents for this kind of thinking. In the early 20th century, some photography theorists, influenced by ideas about the fourth dimension and other emerging scientific theories, speculated that the reality we perceive is only a slice of a much more complex continuum. These men seem to have taken that idea to the extreme, believing that the moment of death, when consciousness supposedly passes from one dimension to another, could be documented if observed simultaneously from multiple precisely calculated viewpoints. In January 1966, Lancaster's investigation took an unexpected turn when he was contacted by a man who identified himself only as John, claiming to be a former low-level employee of the War Department during the period of 1943 to 1945. According to this informant, Reverend Samuel Porter was not simply a military chaplain with a medical discharge, but had been briefly associated with a classified research project known as Operation Persistent Eye. It was a small program, one of those strange projects that emerged during the war when the government was willing to explore any possible advantage. John explained in an interview secretly recorded by Lancaster. The theory was that the camera could capture micro-expressions and non-verbal cues that would reveal when a prisoner was lying, even when human interrogators couldn't detect it. According to John, Porter was recruited for the project due to his unusual background. In addition to his theological studies, he had briefly studied neurology before the war and had a particular interest in physiology of impending death, the physical and neurological changes that occur when a person is close to death. The basic concept involved using advanced photographic techniques to document interrogations of prisoners of war. Porter had a bizarre theory, John continued. He believed that in the final moments of conscious life, when the brain is being deprived of oxygen but has not yet fully died, human perception fundamentally changes. That in that brief interval, perhaps only a few seconds, a person can perceive things normally invisible. And he thought that, with the right equipment, these perceptions could somehow be captured on film. The project was apparently terminated after only a few months, when it became clear it would not produce useful results for the war effort. Porter was discharged, officially for medical reasons, but in reality, according to John, because his supervisors were concerned about the direction his research was taking. He started talking about voluntary experiments with the terminal, basically documenting people who were dying of natural causes. He claimed he could prove his theory if he had complete control over the environment and the subject during the dying process. Obviously, that crossed all ethical lines, even by the most flexible standards of the wartime era. In March 1966, Lancaster finally achieved what seemed to be the final piece of the puzzle: Samuel Porter's whereabouts. Through hospital records obtained through a contact in the Maryland State Mental Health System, he discovered that a patient using the name Samuel P. had been discreetly admitted to a maximum security psychiatric institution in Cumberland, Maryland, in April 1948, just 1 month after the official closure of the Church of Eternal Revelation case. After several frustrated attempts, Lancaster managed to get permission to visit the institution, although he was not allowed to speak directly with the patient, now 80 years old and apparently suffering from severe dementia. The medical director, Dr. Harold Brenner, reluctantly agreed to discuss the case in general terms, confirming that Samuel P. had been admitted under a sealed court order with a diagnosis of religious delusions with homicidal behavior. What I can say is that this patient believed he had discovered a method to see beyond the veil, as he often said, explained Dr. Brenner. His particular fixation was with the exact moment of death, which he saw not as an end, but as a transition to another state of existence that could be scientifically observed and documented under the right conditions. The disturbing part was the extent of his conviction. He believed so deeply in this idea that he considered it justifiable to facilitate this transition for others, as long as he could document it correctly. Dr. Brenner also revealed that Samuel P. had spent the first years of his confinement producing obsessively detailed drawings of what he called the capture apparatus, complex diagrams showing circular camera arrangements, specifications for photographic emulsions, and more disturbingly, meticulous drawings of human facial expressions at various stages of what he labeled as the crossing. The most unsettling thing, concluded Dr. Brenner, is that this patient never showed any remorse or even recognition of having done anything wrong. To this day, in the rare moments of lucidity, he insists that his work was interrupted before it could be completed, that 17 was the necessary number for complete triangulation, but that the true potential of the method would only be realized with a complete set of 21 simultaneous observations. Well, what it really was. In May 1966, Lancaster published his final report on the case, a comprehensive piece titled "The Church That Filmed Death: The True Story of the Filmmakers from Beyond." The article detailed the entire investigation, presenting evidence that the Church of Eternal Revelation had systematically facilitated the deaths of at least 16 vulnerable people, all in deep mourning, convinced by Reverend Porter and his associates that they could see their deceased loved ones again if they participated in the transition process. The article caused a temporary stir and calls for an official reinvestigation of the case, but authorities maintained that, after 18 years, with limited evidence, and most of those involved dead or incapacitated, there was no basis for formally reopening the inquiry. He still talks about it as if it were a legitimate scientific experiment, not. Lancaster was criticized by some as a sensationalist seeking to resurrect an old story to sell newspapers, while others praised him for bringing to light a disturbing case of religious manipulation and exploitation of vulnerable people. A week after the publication of his final report, Lancaster's apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen except his notes on the case and the film fragments he had collected. 2 days later, he received an anonymous letter containing only one sentence. 17 was just the beginning. The work continues elsewhere. Disturbed but determined, Lancaster tried to investigate further, but found doors closed in every direction. The institution in Cumberland suddenly denied that any patient named Samuel P. was or had been admitted there. Dr. Brenner was on extended leave. The hospital records Lancaster had previously consulted now contained an exact gap where the record of Samuel P. should have been. In August 1966, Lancaster was found dead in his car in a rural area of Maryland, apparently a victim of carbon monoxide poisoning. The vehicle's engine was running and the windows were closed. The death was officially classified as suicide, despite the vehement protests of his family and colleagues that Lancaster was not depressed and had mentioned significant new breakthroughs in his investigation just a day earlier. After Lancaster's death, public interest in the case quickly faded. His files on the investigation, which he had prudently distributed among several friends and fellow journalists, mysteriously disappeared or were destroyed in apparently unrelated accidents: a house fire, a basement flood, a robbery. Within a few years, the case of the Church of Eternal Revelation had been almost completely forgotten, existing only as an obscure footnote in Baltimore's history. The old warehouse where the church operated was completely demolished in 1968 to make way for a new industrial complex. During the excavation of the foundations, workers reported finding a small sealed metal box containing what appeared to be an old film roll, but the item disappeared before it could be officially examined. One of the workers, who requested anonymity, described briefly seeing what was inscribed on the side of the box. Number 18. The final observer. And so the case remained, buried under layers of time, institutional forgetting, and possible cover-up. 17 lives lost, 17 documented deaths. A macabre experiment born from the combination of deep grief, religious obsession, and distorted pseudoscience. The complete truth about what really happened in that old cold chamber, what those films truly showed, and whether Porter genuinely believed he had captured the transition from life to death, remains a mystery. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the whole story is the whereabouts of the copies of the 17 original films, confiscated by federal authorities and never officially acknowledged. In 1969, a retired government archivist, speaking on condition of anonymity, stated that the films had been stored at a secure facility in Virginia until 1952, when they were transferred to an unspecified location for continuous analysis. According to this informant, a classified report concluded that the footage contained significant visual anomalies without conventional explanation and recommended additional research under strictly controlled conditions. If such research continued, in what form and with what results remains unknown. What we know for sure is that for 14 months between 1946 and 1948, 17 vulnerable people were convinced they could see their deceased loved ones again if they participated in a ritual that, in reality, was their own death meticulously documented by multiple cameras. And that somehow this story was almost completely erased from public memory, resurfacing only briefly when two dedicated investigators, Daniel Hayes and Robert Lancaster, paid with their own lives for digging too deep. As for Margaret Holloway, the only known participant who survived the process, her final years in Florida were spent in almost complete isolation. The few neighbors who interacted with her described her as distant and always seeming to be looking at something no one else could see. Her death certificate in 1959 listed the cause of death as multiple organ failure, but the doctor who signed the document noted something strange. Even hours after confirmed death, her eyes remained unusually glassy and reflective, as if still registering images. And among her few personal belongings, found in her small house after her death, was a notebook containing only one sentence, repeated on every page, compulsively written in increasingly erratic handwriting. "I am still in the film. I'm still being watched. It never stopped rolling."